Hello and welcome, everybody. It is a pleasure to welcome all of you here today to a brand new course and a brand new teacher. We are honored today to be able to welcome and say a big hello to Rabbi Johnny Solomon. Rabbi Solomon is an individual I feel that I had met only recently, but it was a couple of years ago that I first came across his teachings, and his teachings I came across online through Facebook. And Rabbi Solomon is an exceptional teacher, an incredible scholar, and he has carved out a niche for himself really as an online presence, calling himself the virtual rabbi, a rabbi for those who do not have a rabbi. And I have to tell you, rabbis around the world, not just ordinary people, not just ordinary people, but rabbis, scholars, students around the world will be constantly drawn to Rabbi Solomon's Facebook posts or social media posts simply because of the high quality of the content. And I know, speaking personally, there's been many a sermon I have delivered, many a class I have given, many a presentation where I've been able to lean on Rabbi Johnny's works and wisdom. And he is such an incredible mensch. He does so with this open heart of, I've shared Torah, please use it, please regurgitate it, own it, change it. And he is an incredible mensch. And sometimes you don't know the personality behind the teacher. I want to start out at the outset by saying what a mensch Rabbi Johnny is. Born in the UK and now living in Israel, Rabbi Solomon teaches halakha and Jewish thought at Matan, a Midrashet Lindenbaum, and works as I mentioned, a virtual rabbi providing online spiritual coaching, halachic consultations, and Torah study sessions to men, women, and couples around the world. Rabbi Solomon was also a very close student of the late beloved Rabbi Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory, and that is the course to which we now turn our attention. Rabbi Sacks, a spiritual biography. Without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rabbi Solomon, who I am making a co-host of Zoom. Good, you're all set up and good to go. Rabbi Solomon, welcome.
Okay, so I'll unmute. I hope you can hear me well. It's lovely to see you. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you to Rabbi Fishman for all that you're doing in sharing Torah around the world, and in particular, in the extraordinary programming that you're doing for Sha'ar Shamayim. What I'm going to do now is share my screen and open up a PowerPoint. I want to just check that you can see my screen right now. Can everybody see that? Wonderful. And so what we're going to do for the next 45, 50 minutes is explore the first of our 5 themes, namely Rabbi Sacks on identity, but within a slightly different framework. I've been lucky to be teaching about Rabbi Sacks, or teaching his ideas, for almost a decade now. But what I've done in recent years is focus not just on what he taught us, but also about him and the relationship between the ideas he shared and his personal journey. And so what this class is about is understanding him as a spiritual individual, a spiritual leader, through reflecting on his teachings. And so today we'll reflect on his teachings on identity while also thinking about his personal journey, where it teaches us about how he became who he was and who we so very much revered. And next week we'll talk about self-belief and et cetera, et cetera. Hopefully that's relatively clear. So just in terms of how we're going to proceed with this class, I love conversation. This isn't meant to be a lecture, so feel free to add your own voice to this conversation. If you have an idea to share, feel free to do that by unmuting yourself or by writing the chat, although oftentimes I'm only just able to see that a little bit later on in the session. But let's begin, and let's begin with one of his most majestic books, Radical Then, Radical Now, which, by the way, it was printed under the title A Letter in the Scroll in in the US because the word radical seemed to be a bit too radical. Be that as it may, this is an important book where he explains what it means to be a Jew and what it means to identify as a Jew. And since we're talking about identity, it seems to be a very, very useful first pit stop to explore his description of identity. Now, to be clear, even though he's speaking in the first person, he's actually describing a Jew in general. And yet when he speaks about Jews, he's also speaking about himself as a Jew. So let's read what Rabbi Sacks has to say about identity. And he says, the most fundamental question, who am I, mi anochi, which are the words, by the way, that Moshe Rabbeinu uttered when he was at the burning bush, the sneh. The most fundamental question, who am I, the one that never changes, involves a journey back through time into who my parents were and theirs and so on as far back as I can go. That is a story into which I was born. I may choose not to continue it, he adds, but I cannot deny it without in some way living a lie. The history of my family is where my identity begins. Now, as mentioned, he was speaking generally, but he was also speaking personally. He's saying, me as a Jew requires that I reflect on the journey of my family, my background. And if you've read through Rabbi Sacks's books, and thank God I have, you'll know that he does make reference to his background, to his family. He actually bears his soul. And what I'm trying to do in this course is explore those parts of his teachings where his ideas fuse with his personal journey to give us a sense of his spiritual biography. So let's proceed. And now he tells us a little bit about his background. He informs us as follows. My grandparents were not born in this country. Many, even most of the Jews in Britain had grandparents who came here in the great wave of immigration from Eastern Europe between 1880 and 1914. Of course, different countries had different waves of immigration, but that was when most of Eastern European Jews came into the UK. We are Anglo-Jews of the third generation. It is an almost universal law that inherited wealth lasts 3 generations, not more. And he then goes on to say, the same applies to inherited Judaism. Ours is the last generation that can still remember Bubba and Zayda from the Haim with their fluent Yiddish and undiminished Yiddishkeit. Ours is the last generation for whom Jewish identity can be sustained by memory alone. And where does he write this? Well, in fact, one of his earliest books was, Will We Have Jewish Grandchildren? And so he's saying, my grandparents were from that world. The question is, what will be of their grandchildren and what will be of the 4th generation? In fact, the next line from this book tells us an insight from the Gerer Rebbe, who describes the 4 sons of Seder night as being 4 generations, and the 4th being the one who doesn't even know how to ask questions. And Rabbi Sacks saw his mission in making sure that that 4th generation has a reason to want to be Jewish. He saw as part of his central mission about developing clarity regarding Jewish identity for the generation who chooses it and doesn't just receive it. So you can see what he's doing here is telling us a bit about his life, but in so doing, giving us insight about our life. And as we're going to see in a moment, the choices he made are really a profound lesson about the choices we could make. Now, let's proceed, because he then tells us a little bit about his family. By the way, these are quotes from also many different places. Some of his books, sometimes they are radio interviews. Most of the material is found in some expression in many of his books, but I'm giving you the best formulation of the ideas I want to share. And he says in an interview with Krista Tippett titled On Being, and you can listen to that, I was the oldest of 4 boys. My father, who had come to Britain as a refugee from Poland at the age of 6, had to leave school at the age of 14, so he never had an education, not Jewish or secular. You're going to hear how that had a profound effect on him. The fact that his father was not schooled in general or Jewish education strongly motivated Rabbi Sacks in terms of the choices that he made. He goes on to tell us, my mother had to leave school at the age of 16, so my parents didn't know that much, meaning he's telling us in code that his Jewish home, the home where he grew up, his childhood was not a home filled with Torah books like the ones I have behind me. He came from a traditional Jewish home, which strongly valued Jewish practices, strongly valued Jewish tradition. But neither his father nor mother had such a strong Jewish education. And he says, and you know, I tend to think that's the greatest gift you can give a child. What is? A love of Judaism. Wordsworth said it beautifully, what we love, others will love, and we will show them how. In fact, the Rambam says something very similar. So what Rabbi Sacks tells us is, I didn't come from a very learned home, but I came from a passionate home. And though Rabbi Sacks was an intellectual, he was also a passionate Jew. And he really wanted to transmit that both in terms of him as a leader, and he really wanted us to transmit that, each of us in our own home, for our children, for our grandchildren, and for our great-grandchildren. So you can see here again, he's telling us about his life in terms of helping us make sense of our life. This is not just biography, this is spiritual biography. This is using the journey he went on to inspire us in terms of the journeys we can go on. Any questions before we proceed? Pause just for a second. Okay, if so, let's move on. Now, he tells a story, a very, very powerful story, and I want you to remember this story because we're going to come back to something very similar just before we end this evening. He says, once when I was a child, my family was on holiday in a little coastal town in the south of England. It was Shabbat and we'd just left the synagogue and were walking back for lunch. Behind us, another member of the congregation came rushing up and pointed to the yarmulke, the kippah I was wearing. He said to my father, this had been in the early 50s, your son has forgotten to take his yarmulke off. This was in the days when it was not done to wear overt signs of your Jewishness in public. The old dictum, be a Jew at home and a man in the street, was still in force. By walking down the road with my head covering, I was committing a solecism, and our friend was from the synagogue assumed not unnaturally that I was unaware of it. The guy was trying to help. He meant it kindly. He was simply trying to save me from embarrassment, much as if my shirt tail had been hanging out. For once, meaning on this one occasion, my father got angry and replied, no child of mine will ever be ashamed to be Jewish in public. And we continued on our way. It was not a very tactful response, says Rabbi Sacks, but it taught me, as perhaps no formal lesson could, never to be ashamed of who I was. Just think about that story happening to him maybe when he was 6, 7, 8 years old. This lesson became something that he passed on to Jews around the world. Never be ashamed of who you are. That lesson found within Radical Then, Radical Now becomes really the blueprint of that book. Be proud of your Judaism. And so here too, we have a piece of spiritual biography, telling us a little about what happened when he was young, then telling us a little bit about how he processed that, how he lived with that lesson, how he channeled it, and how he lived by it. Now, I mentioned beforehand how Rabbi Sacks's parents, especially his father, did not have a strong general or Jewish education because they left school early. And this, as I say, motivated Rabbi Sacks. And he writes in the final page of this book, Radical Then, Radical Now, he says, when dedicating the book to his father, he said, when I was young, I would ask my father many questions about Judaism, and his answer was always the same. Jonathan, I didn't have an education, and so I do not know the answers to your questions. but one day you will have the education I missed, and then you will teach me the answers. When I read that, and certainly when I share that, it takes my breath away. Because the power of that response catapulted Rabbi Sacks. The power of that response of Rabbi Sacks' father saying, I don't know, but I want you to know. I don't know, but I wait for the time for you to teach me. It's a beautiful response. Because what it tells us is the ultimate dream of a parent is for their child to learn and grow, for their child to be proud of their Judaism, for their child to seek answers to questions, to remain curious, to explore. And that's what he got from his home. True, they may not have been very learned, but they were passionate Jews. They were motivated Jews. They were proud Jews. And they were aspirational Jews. Just think, with those ingredients, that's what can drive somebody to grow, to learn, to become a great Torah figure, a great Jewish leader. So this is a powerful story about Rabbi Sacks and his father, a powerful message which continued to inspire him all the days of his life. Now, this is an important piece, which again we're going to return to later on. It comes from the Persistence of Faith, which is a record of some of his earliest lectures. And he tells us the Jews who came to Britain as refugees, among them my late father, became passionately British as well as Jewish. I want to stress this. They were British and Jewish. It's not or. Remember that guy said you got to put the kippah away, put yarmulke away. It's not one or the other. It's one and the other. They saw no contradiction between the two, nor should we, continues Rabbi Sacks. In the secular state, there is no incompatibility between religious and national identities. Nonetheless, a sense of collective belonging does not happen without sustained and focused effort. I argued then, he says, and I believe still, that each of us has to learn to be bilingual, at home in two identities. One we share with fellow believers, the other we share with fellow citizens. This wasn't just something he heard from his dad, he saw in his home. This became part of the central identity. This became part of the core theology of Rabbi Sacks, Torah v'chokhmah, engaging with fellow believers, engaging with fellow citizens. In his case, not just being British and Jewish, but being part of the world conversation as well as being part of the Jewish conversation. He wanted both, he needed both. And to his mind, to say that one outweighed the other, or one couldn't exist with the other, was a negation of where he came from. And remember, for Rabbi Sacks, identity is about where you come from. He'd reflected on how his parents had held together those two identities, and he said, I want to do that too. And so as he grew, as he learned more, as he discovered more, as he found more and more answers, even answers to the questions his father couldn't answer, he continued to do that while at the same time continuing to learn about the wider world. And that's part of his biography, and truth be told, it's part of his spiritual biography, this duality. Now, whenever you read about Rabbi Sacks, and truth be told, whenever he spoke about his life journey, he would make reference to two major moments, 1967 and 1968. And I have to do so, but then we'll be adding in some extra details, some details that perhaps some of you may not. So let's now talk about 1967, which in terms of Jewish history is the year, I presume you know, of the Six-Day War. And he writes, and it's important for us to pay attention to how he describes these days, not just in terms of what was happening globally and what was happening in Israel, what was happening in the hearts and the minds of Jews around the world in those weeks and those days, where there was such a fear of the future of the young fledgling state of Israel, and truth be told, of Jewish communities worldwide. So it was in 1967 that an extraordinary thing began to happen. Throughout the university, Jews suddenly became visible. Day after day, they crowded into a little synagogue in the center of town. Students and dons who had never before publicly identified as Jews could be found there praying. Why? Because they were petrified. What's going to happen to our people? They hear stories of public parks in Israel being dug for mass graves. Others began collecting money. Everyone wanted to help in some way to express their solidarity with their identification with Israel's fate. As he continues, the rest is history. The war was fought and won. It lasted a mere 6 days, one of the most spectacular victories in modern history. We could celebrate and breathe safely again. Life went back to normal. But then, as he continues, but not completely, it didn't go back to normal. For I had witnessed, and he says he also refers to many of his peers and many younger and older than him. For I had witnessed something in those days and weeks, and he was 19 years old, that didn't make sense in the rest of my world. It had nothing to do with politics or war or even prayer. It had to do with Jewish identity. Collectively, the Jewish people had looked in the mirror and said, we are still Jews. A Jewish people who, for the most part, were at best Jews in synagogue, but they hid symbols of Jewish identity in public. All of a sudden, the Jews said out loud and very proud, we are still Jews. And by that, they meant more than a private declaration of faith, religion in the conventional sense of the word. It meant that they felt part of a people, involved in its fate, implicated in its destiny, caught up in its tragedy, exhilarated by its survival. I had felt it, he says, so had every other Jew I knew. The 6-day war was spiritually transformative for many, many Jews around the world and for Jonathan Sacks. As he says, what I discovered in those emotional days of the summer of 1967, perhaps what each of us discovers when Jewish identity takes us by surprise. Isn't that an interesting phrase? Jewish identity takes you by surprise. Sometimes events happen where we don't quite realize how deep certain feelings are felt, how deep a certain identity goes. Is that this covenant is still alive. It still had the power to move and transform me and my contemporaries, more power perhaps than any of us had suspected until then. But how, he says, I was moved by curiosity to find out more about the horizontal links that bind Jews to one another and the vertical links binding us to a history and a hope. What did it do? It fostered more questions. It led to a greater hunger, a greater interest in Judaism. Now I feel more strongly Jewish. Now I feel more connected to my soul. What do I do with this? I want to find out more. I'm hungry. And then he tells us, the year was 1968. I was then a philosophy student at Cambridge University. It was not an environment conducive to religious belief. Skepticism or atheism were the order of the day. But the 6-day war the year before had awakened my interest in Jewish identity. And so what does he do? I decide to travel to America, the home of Jewry's leading philosophers and thinkers, to find out for myself whether a cogent case could be made for Jewish faith in the modern age. He knew of ancient Judaism, but he was dazzled by what took place, not just in terms of the 6-day war, but in terms of response to the 6-day war. He saw Jews, modern Jews, reaching out and celebrating their Jewish identity. And the question is, so how does this ancient religion, to which he was loyal, but at the same time hadn't fully immersed himself in terms of study and philosophical understanding, he wants to know, how do I bring this into my modern world? How do I bring Judaism into the university campus? How do I bring Judaism into my world where things seem to at times conflict with the religious sentiments that I thought were core to Judaism? And so what does he do? He goes on a spiritual, intellectual pilgrimage to meet great Jewish thinkers, in particular two. One was Rabbi Joseph Ber Soloveitchik, the great Talmud teacher of Yeshiva University. But in particular, and he often refers to this, and we'll do in a moment, it was to meet Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, known as a Lubavitcher Rebbe, really the seventh Lubavitcher Rebbe, and whose counsel was sought by men and women around the world. And he said, I got to meet this guy. I've been told that he'll be somebody who helps me make sense of being a Jew in the modern world. And so continues Rabbi Sacks. He said, well, he tells a story of going to America and waiting in order to be able to find a window of time to be able to meet the Rebbe, but we then jump into that story. And he says, I sat with the Rebbe for 25 minutes. 20 to 25 minutes, which we'll see in a moment, was life-changing. You know, sometimes we waste so much time, you can change your life in 2 minutes. But as he says, my whole life changed within those 20 to 25 minutes. And the interesting thing was that he didn't really let me ask him questions. Rabbi Sacks had come, or Jonathan Sacks at that point, had come with a whole bunch of questions about philosophy, which he was studying, and about Judaism, and about modernity. But though he came with this list of questions, ultimately the Lubavitcher Rebbe asked Jonathan Sacks questions. He was interviewing me of sorts. He said to me something like this: how many Jewish students were at Cambridge University where he was studying? He said, I don't know, but around 1,000. Asked the Lubavitcher Rebbe, how many Jewish students go to the Jewish Society, the JSOC, get involved in Jewish life? I said about 100. He said, you mean 90% are just completely disengaged? The answer is yes. Said the Lubavitcher Rebbe to Jonathan Sacks, what are you doing about it? And I, being very English at the time, started a sentence with the following word: in a situation in which I find myself, which is a really English way of saying, could you ask me something else, please? And the rabbi, believe it or not, who was a very, very polite man, actually interrupted me in the middle of that sentence. He said, you don't find yourself in a situation, you put yourself in a situation, and thereby I think you should put yourself in a different situation. And this was absolutely mind-blowing, says Rabbi Sacks. There were hundreds of people waiting outside for their interview. And here was this great man essentially telling me to become a leader, which is the last thing in the world I wanted to be. Many years later, I said, what I learned at that moment was that people thought of this great man as a religious leader with thousands of followers. Yes, that's true, but that's the least interesting thing about him. Good leaders create followers. Great leaders create leaders. And that is what he did at that moment. And that moment, those 20 to 25 minutes, never left me. It changed my entire life. It didn't change it immediately. It changed it slowly and gradually. But when you're told by one of the great spiritual leaders of the 20th century, you're going to have to lead, and you're going to have to lead because you're in that situation where you can do something, that did actually change my life. The word wow comes to mind when you read that story. Wow. Wow that the Rebbe told him that, and wow that he was ready to hear it. He didn't straight away turn around his whole life, but he paid attention. He didn't shut down that conversation. He didn't walk away saying the guy doesn't. He listened. He listened. And if you've heard of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, because he heard those words. It's really that simple. This is called Rabbi Sacks' A Spiritual Biography. And this is a major pivot in the spiritual biography of Rabbi Sacks. So he goes to the Rebbe and he has this meeting, and he then goes back to Cambridge University and becomes more involved, gets more engaged in the JSOC, inviting more students to the synagogue, doing Friday night dinners, all those kind of things. Then what happens after he finishes university? Well, the story I'm about to tell you is much less well known. I mean, seriously not well known. But it's also very, very telling in terms of understanding Rabbi Sacks' spiritual biography. So let's proceed. And Now, this comes from a Hebrew newspaper, I actually have it over here, called Makor Rishon. Not long after Rabbi Sacks died, his brother Alan was interviewed. And Alan shared some things that perhaps Rabbi Sacks himself had never fully shared. This was one of them. I remember reading it at the time saying, wow, I didn't really know that. In 1969, after he received his first-class honors degree in philosophy, meaning after he finished his degree, Rabbi Sacks traveled to Israel to study in Kfar Chabad. So 1967 happens, then 1968, he meets with the Rebbe, he finishes 69. What does he do? He goes to study in basically the Chabad in the Lubavitch Yeshiva. He met the Lubavitcher Rebbe in 1968. The next summer, he goes to the Lubavitch Yeshiva in Israel, known as Kfar Chabad. And you may know, the Rabbi Sacks was a guest speaker at those giant kinnus, those gatherings of the shlichim of Chabad some years ago. And when he was that guest speaker, he says, this was an incredible experience. So you'd think, wow. So he went to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Next year, he goes to the Lubavitch Yeshiva and he tells these Lubavitchers some years later, it was fantastic. However, and this is the bit that's less well known, as his brother Alan recalls, and this is in the newspaper, though he decided to spend a year studying at Kfar Chabad, he didn't remain there for the full year. He was there only for some months. Why? Once my brother told me, he said, it was clear, and this is so powerful, it was clear that if I stay in Kfar Chabad, they'll make me religious. Now, by the way, he was already, religious in as much as he was wearing kippah and by certainly observing Shabbat. What he means by religious is kind of wearing kind of religious garb and being more committed. This was his first entry into meaningful Torah study. He'd not gone to Jewish schools. So he says, if I stay in Kfar Chabad, they'll make me religious. I, however, want to make myself religious. Continued his brother. In short, he felt he had to leave early for the sake of maintaining his own identity. Now, for those who don't realize how significant this window into Rabbi Sacks' life is, you may not realize how staunchly independent he was as a thinker. True, he quoted lots of other thinkers. What made Rabbi Sacks so unique is because he recognized that uniqueness. And he didn't want to be a carbon copy of a certain institution, a replica of a certain teacher. He didn't want to be molded by others. He wanted to hear the wisdom of others and self-sculpt, self-mold himself. And he felt there came a certain tipping point that if he stayed, he would lose the ability to do that. And he said, I want to be the sculptor of my own religious personality. And so he left. All too often, by the way, I think that many of us lack a sense of ownership of our own religious or spiritual identity. We often mirror what we see in other role models, and role models are super important. But though we should be inspired by others, we should recognize our own unique contributions. We should be interested not just in being made by others, but in fact, in making ourselves. Now, the truth is, notwithstanding this, Rabbi Sacks continued to have incredible respect and admiration and affection for Lubavitch and Chabad. And we're going to see in a second to what extent. But do you remember I mentioned beforehand how Rabbi Sacks' father saw being British and being Jewish as able to coexist? In fact, it's a very beneficial thing to coexist both with your fellow believers and your fellow citizens. And I emphasized also how Rabbi Sacks really took that as a central piece of his theology, emphasizing Torah v'chokhmah. Here's an insight he says in a short interview that he did. And he says, 45 years ago, when I was a student at Kfar Chabad, you can imagine, it's a place where studying Torah all day, all evening, different parts of Torah, both classic Torah and all Hasidic Torah. He said, what was I doing in the evening where all the other people are learning the Tanya or learning this, that, and the other? I read Shakespeare. He says, my friends thought I was crazy, but Shakespeare is God's gift to humans. Now, I hope you realize how this really serves as a commentary to what we just read. He says, I want them to learn Torah. I want me to learn Torah, but I also need Shakespeare in my life. I also need science. I also need mathematics. I also need poetry. I'm somebody who needs both because I believe that we need to engage in the world as well as engage with our tradition. So that was what he was doing for Chabad. And I think in certain sense, that Shakespeare became his kind of cultural lifeboat. But then there came a point when he felt he'd have to give it up. And so he said, I'm not prepared to do that. Now, I mentioned that Rabbi Sacks continued to have a deep respect, admiration, affection for Chabad. In fact, his first book, his very first book, is in fact summaries of the Rebbe's Sichot, called Torah Studies. I have it just behind me. Moreover, though, later on, when interviewed on a BBC radio program called Desert Island Discs, where famous people are interviewed and said, if you're on a desert island, what few things would you bring with you? And Rabbi Sacks said, I'd bring like a Talmud, I'd bring this, that, and the other. It's a great thing to listen to with Sue Lawley. And here's a link. And by the way, I'll be sending you this presentation for all of you to review. But what did Rabbi Sacks say on Desert Island Discs? Amongst the Talmud, the other things he'd bring if you were stuck on a desert island, he says, I'd bring a song. I'd bring a song called Sama Nafshi. And this is what he says. This song comes from that period of my life that I spent in Israel among the mystics of Lubavitch, meaning when he was in Kfar Chabad. It's called Sama Lecha Nafshi, which is a line from Psalms, which means, my soul thirsts for you. And this comes from the world of East European Jewish piety of the 18th century. The Jewish mystics used to gather together towards the close of the Sabbath and sit around a table and drink vodka and tell stories and sing songs, so as not to end this day of rest and just try and cling hold to the last moments of its sanctity. But these words of King David in the book of Psalms, Sama lecha nafshi, my soul thirsts for you, when he heard them, and especially when he heard them sung according to the Chabad Nigun, which you can find, by the way, on YouTube, it moved Rabbi Sacks. People may think of him as this great academic, this great scholar. He was a deeply spiritual person. And that spirit was kindled both from 1967 and when he was in Kfar Chabad in 1969. He just wanted it to grow in a slightly different direction. Sama lecha nafshi, my soul thirsts for you. And let me tell you, as he continued in Desert Island Discs, he says, quite simply, I hope one day something like that will be my effort, that his soul thirsted for God. And let me tell you, when Rabbi Sacks died, at his funeral, his dear friend and the Chazan Lionel Rosenfeld, he sang, Sama lecha nafshi. You can watch that also on YouTube. You can hear him sing those words, saying, my dear friend, my dear Rebbe, I'm going to sing you those songs, because that's how you lived. And this is me. This is me by Rabbi Sacks' grave, and you'll see there, the Hebrew at the bottom, Sama lecha nafshi, my soul thirsts for you. Because while Rabbi Sacks was this great scholar, he was a deeply spiritual person whose soul yearned and was hungry for more growth. He yearned and was hungry to inspire others to grow too. We're coming a little bit towards the end of our learning. Let me share with you, though, a further story which is going to help us come full circle in terms of understanding Rabbi Sacks' spiritual biography. But however, just before I do so, remember this is a 5-part series. So in our future sections, we're going to be talking about his deep love, his wife Elaine. That's absolutely core to his overall personal identity, but I've chosen to speak about that in a future session. We'll talk about his passion for study, for music as well. Let's now Let's now hear a little bit more from him. Because when being interviewed by Krista Tippett, she said, one second, from what you described about your background, a much more traditional Jewish home, doesn't sound like becoming a rabbi was expected of you. He says, expected? Are you kidding me? And these are his words. I had absolutely no intention of becoming a rabbi. I went to university to study economics and then philosophy. But in my first year, the 6-Day War happened, as he said. Now, we don't know, we can't understand in retrospect quite how tense that was, the buildup. We've mentioned this before. And we, born after the Holocaust, felt that there was a real possibility, God forbid, of a second Holocaust. Then, of course, the war happened with astonishing speed. There was a sense of exhilaration. But you know, and this is him really reflecting on the things we've just described. I'd been really shaken up by this, and I sort of began very slowly. Remember, we said it was a process, not a moment, over the years, to delve more and more deeply into the question of what it was to be a Jew. Not intending to be a rabbi, just to get deeper to the roots of this faith in this 4,000-year-old tradition. Now, I've just seen a request. Yes, we're going to go through the quotes once again, and again, these will be shared. Now, as he mentioned, he never intended to become a rabbi. But that moment, that meeting with the Lubavitcher Rebbe changed his life. Because the more he became a leader, the more he realized that there was a need to lead. The more he realized that there was much to learn. The more he realized that if people don't know their story, then their identity is naturally going to be weakened. If you had to distill really the entire mission, as I mentioned this before, of Rabbi Sacks, it's for us to know our story, for us to understand and appreciate why be Jewish. And let's now come to our last story. He says, when I finished university and was teaching philosophy, most of my other colleagues were Marxists. Some were Jewish, most were not, but almost all were irreligious or anti-religious. So this is now already, he's in his 20s, late 20s. In those days, I had no thought of eventually becoming a rabbi, but the lessons of my childhood had stayed with me enough to make me wear a yarmulke at all times. One particularly windy day, as I was crossing the playing fields, it blew off, my yarmulke blew off, and instead of putting it back, I carried it until I reached the lecture room. So he was walking without a kippah. The kippah was in his pocket. The next day, I was summoned by the head of the department. Is everything all right, Jonathan? He asked. Yes, I replied, puzzled by his question. It's just, I saw you yesterday crossing the playing field, not wearing your skull cap, and I wondered whether anything had happened. It was an astonishing moment, says Rabbi Sacks. I suddenly realized, and remember the story about the kippah when he was a youngster. He said, I suddenly realized that though he was not Jewish, he was deeply troubled at the thought that I might be losing my faith, whether out of philosophical doubt or the sheer isolation of being the only religious Jew on campus. I don't even know if I fully understand his reaction, but I think it meant that my being true to my faith was part of the security of his world. Knowing where I was, he knew where he was. He was neither religious or Jewish, but in some obscure way, it helped him to know there were people who were both. And if I gave up, something larger was giving way. He's continued, and this is my final slide. Since then, I've encountered this phenomenon so many times in different ways that I'm tempted to assert it in the form of two principles, which, if not always true, are true more often than not. Non-Jews respect Jews who respect Judaism, and they're embarrassed by Jews who are embarrassed by Judaism. This is something he said time after time after time. Ambivalence is bad for us, for those who relate to us, and above all, for our children. And ambivalence has been writ large in the identity of Jews for the last 2 centuries. So what did he do? This man, this leader, this teacher, who discovered the power of Jewish identity, took the baton to teach us what it meant to be a Jew, to explain to us what it means to be part of our people, to inspire us about how to be proud of our Jewish identity. From when he was a young child, and that man was telling him, your kippah's still on, And his father rebuked him, saying, my child will never be ashamed of his Jewishness. To this story, to every single thing he did, Rabbi Sacks was about Jewish pride. It was about Jewish identity. It was about that duality of Torah and Chokhmah, of being able to excel with Torah and still appreciating Shakespeare, of not just receiving your Judaism, but also self-sculpting yourself as a Jew, owning yourself as a Jew. He believed not just in being followers, although he believed strongly in followership. He believed that great leaders make great leaders, and boy, did he do that. And so we see in this story, in this journey, so much about Rabbi Sacks, not just as a teacher, but as a person, as a Jew, as a young man, as an older man, finding his way, finding his path. So this is our first installment of Rabbi Sacks' spiritual biography, with our particular emphasis on identity. What I'm going to do quickly, as I was asked to do so, is just go through the slides once more for those who wish. But as mentioned, these will be sent to you. So we began about the first question being, who am I? And the importance of knowing your background, your story, where you come from. We continued by Rabbi Sacks telling us about his background, and yet how important it is for each generation to own their Judaism, because Judaism can't just naturally be passed on without some intentionality. He speaks about the passion towards Judaism in his home, notwithstanding perhaps the lack of structured Jewish knowledge. He spoke about the Jewish pride that he learned from his father when walking back from shul that day. Remember, we told the story about how he would ask his father questions. His father would say, I don't know, but there'll be a time when you find the answers. We spoke about Rabbi Sacks' recognition that one can be a Jew and one can be part of the global conversation, the commitments we share with fellow believers and those we also share with fellow citizens. We spoke about the impact of the Six-Day War in terms of him really deepening his connection with Jewish peoplehood. We spoke about his journey in 1968 to meet the Lubavitcher Rebbe and how the Lubavitcher Rebbe made him into a leader. We spoke how in 1969 he went to Kfar Chabad, and yet he also left because he made a choice about the kind of religious identity he wanted to have. How? Because he wanted to blend Torah with Chokhmah. We mentioned how Rabbi Sacks was a spiritual man, and how that's even on his gravestone. True, he never intended to be a rabbi. And yet, as we told at the end, the lesson that came through so many of the stories we've told is about being a proud Jew. And he became a leader, and he taught us to be proud Jews. So thank you for that. I'm just going to now have a look at the chat. So from Rabbi Joseph from Montreal, to be a Jew is to desperately desire that your descendants desperately desire to be Jewish. That's beautiful. Lordy, thank you so much for sharing them. If you have any other questions, I'm happy to answer them, but I'm also aware of time. So it's an open mic to anybody who wishes to comment on anything I've shared or raise any questions perhaps for our future sessions.
I'll just take this opportunity, Reb Johnny, to point out that Rabbi Sacks has had a tremendous impact on my life, as he has on yours. And I too pride myself on thinking that I have read almost all of his material. But you were, as I have encountered on more than one occasion now, one step ahead of me in terms of finding sources that I myself have not seen. And that quote from his brother in the Israeli newspaper was actually very shocking to me, because when you think you've read everything there is, there's no more surprises. And here I am finding myself surprised. So I thought that was a fantastic source And I thank you for that. I want to share with everybody that when I say that I think I've read everything Rabbi Sacks has written, I'm not saying that arrogantly, but rather as a devoted student of his. And he literally had such a life-changing impact upon me that there isn't a work of his that I haven't pored over. So for Rabbi Johnny Solomon to share with us something that I haven't seen, I want you really to realize he's speaking about one of the world's experts on Rabbi Sacks. And it reminds me, and I should also point out, that if you go onto the Rabbi Sacks website, there is an incredible tool there called quotations. And so many hundreds and hundreds, thousands actually of quotations. It's Rabbi Johnny who put that all together. So I know this is a new teacher for us here in the Shah Learning Center. And I want you just to have the scope and realization of who it is that we are fortunate enough to learn from, both today and in the coming weeks. Rabbi Solomon, fantastic presentation, and we'll give another opportunity. Any other questions, comments, criticisms? Okay, please stay tuned, as this is a 5-part series taking place over the next number of Tuesdays, and at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you are listening to the recording, we have another 4 weeks coming up as well. We're going to be speaking about Rabbi Sacks on self-belief, Rabbi Sacks on failure, Rabbi Sacks on joy, and then finishing Rabbi Sacks on spirituality. Rabbi Solomon, thank you so much. This was absolutely wonderful. And we wish you well. Going